So shalom, good evening to friends near and far for this Yahrzeit Shiur, for Dayan Lopian's 10th Yahrzeit Shiur, Moreno Rav Gershon Lopian, but Moreno Rav Aryeh Lev. It's been a difficult 10 years, and everybody who's here, I know, misses Dayan Lopian very dearly. And what I wanted to do in this Shiur is firstly simply acknowledge this day, acknowledge a Rav who made such a difference to so many of us and so many more, and to share some ideas which actually have only recently become known. And as a result of that, hopefully we want to learn not only the teachings of the Dayan, but also the teachings of his teacher, and recognize how the Dayan wasn't just a remarkable posek, but also a conduit of halachic decision-making, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. Now, if you are here, it means you likely have long memories of Dayan Lopian, and I know many of you. We daven together in the Edgeway Yeshua synagogue, and what I want to just briefly do is reflect on my memories, and in so doing, make this clear how personal this shiur is. I'm sorry, we're getting pinged by people joining the shiur. Here are 4 pictures. One is a picture of Dayan Lopian at my bar mitzvah in 1989, taken from Kinloss Synagogue, where we had celebrated my bar mitzvah party. One is a picture of Dayan Lopian dancing with me. He was the Masada Kedushin of our wedding, and one of the Eidim. And in addition to that, he joined us to celebrate, and that's me dancing with him. One is a picture, the first walk we went with our eldest daughter, Meira, was to visit Dayan Lopian. He took her, kissed her, cuddled her, and of course his phone was ringing with Shila's. And so there is a picture of him holding our daughter while answering Shila's. And there is a picture of me visiting Dayan Lopian the day before I made Aliyah in 2012. And in fact, I just want to dwell on that visit, because in that moment, not only did he give me a bracha, but I gave him a gift. And it's a gift which is relevant to this shiur. I thought, well, I'm leaving England, and I don't know when I'm next going to see the Dayan. Sadly, that was the last time I saw him. But I wanted to give him a gift that was meaningful and appropriate. I thought I could give him Sfarim, but he had a lot of Sfarim. So instead, we know that in his shiurim, he used to reference some of his teachers. Of course, the Zayda, Rabbi Elia Lopian. We would also reference Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky and Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. And in this shiur, we're going to be exploring his relationship with Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. So what I did was, I went to a store and I got 2 mugs made. And on one side it said, Havashayta b'tzomes divreihem. You should drink with thirst from their words. Because when Dayan Lopian spoke about his teachers, he did so with such enthusiasm. And on the other side was, on one mug, a picture of Yaakov Kamenetsky, on another, a picture of Rav Moshe Feinstein. And I gave it to him, and he was so taken by that, because it represented his chain in the Masorah, his chain in the Jewish tradition, how he'd learned from these great teachers, and how not only did he pass on his own wisdom, but he was also passing on the wisdom that he'd received from those teachers and them from theirs, and back ultimately to Har Sinai. And for him, Masorah tradition was everything. And so those mugs with pictures of his teachers explaining how he drank their wisdom with thirst, and then ultimately how we drank his wisdom with thirst, represented how he was our teacher and he was their students. Having said that, I'd like to speak about the impact of Dayan Lopian, not only during his life, but also since he passed. This is a beautiful picture that my brother and sister-in-law bought for me quite some years ago, painted by Ruth Silverstone of Manchester, of Dayan Lopian. And there you can see a picture actually of my house. That's actually taken from where I sit for our Shabbos meals. Whenever I sit, I can see a picture of Dayan Lopian smiling. And he had such an impact on myself and my wife. And I'm sure he did on all of you too. In that sense, not only are his words continuing to ring in our ears and within our heart, but there's a real sense of presence in our life and real presence in our home. That Dayan Lopian was a contributory factor to many of the things that I've done and many of the things that I continue to do. Be that as it may, I'd like to talk in this shiur about his relationship with his teacher, or one of his teachers, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. And I just want to explain to you the structure of this shiur so that everyone's on the same page. What I'm going to do is briefly mention his time with Rabbi Moshe. You can see this here in the slide. And then we're going to look at about 10 to 12 different rulings that Dayan Lopian transmitted from Rabbi Moshe Feinstein and that have recently been published. Now, while doing so, if you have any questions, feel free to share something in the chat. And then perhaps afterwards, if you have any questions, we'll unmute and we can discuss anything. Now, Dayan Lopian was appointed Rav of Edrei Yeshurun in 1976, the year that I was born. But a couple of years beforehand, he accompanied his uncle, Rabbi Lev Gurvitz, to the Aguda Convention, and that's where he met Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. And Dayan Lopian then asked to have shimush. That means to be present in the home and in the life of Moshe Feinstein and see how he decided halachic queries. And not only did he receive that from Moshe, but Dayan Lopian provided that to many of us informally and many people formally too. And Moshe said yes, and that led to Dayan Lopian going to the United States and being there for 5 straight months, leaving his home because shimush was so important to him, to be able to have a good understanding of how to paskin shilos and how to show a sensitivity to people who ask halachic queries. And this he did in 1975. And then basically the next year he was appointed Rav of Edrei Yeshurun, which means that Dayan Lopian arrived at the shul that was and continues to be certainly a form of home to me, straight away after having spent, not straight away that next day, but soon after having spent 5 months with arguably one of the most significant poskim of the 20th century. Spent 5 months having daily shimush with Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. And that shaped how Dayan Lopian approached the questions that we asked him. And the time spent with Rabbi Moshe Feinstein and the continuing relationship we had with him certainly had an effect on our lives. Now you'll note, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein died in 1986. That means there's a 10-year overlap between when Dayan Lopian arrived in Edrei Yeshurun and when Rabbi Moshe died. And when queries arise, as the Dayan was our Rav, there were times when he'd call his teacher, Rabbi Moshe. And Rabbi Moshe Feinstein's rulings were some of the things that Dayan Lopian guided to you or me or other people not on this Zoom call. So it's important to know that we are part of a connection which not only has its centerpiece, our Rav, the Mara Da'atra, Dayan Gershon Lopian, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, but also was influenced by his Rav, his teacher, amongst many, was Rav Moshe Feinstein, known as a Gadol Hadar, a Pesach Hadar, author of the response to Igros Moshe, as you can see here in the picture. Now, having said that, why is this a relevant topic? And in many ways, why I've tried to give shiurim about Dayan Lopian over the past 10 years. But until now, I've not really shared much about the rulings that he transmitted from his teacher, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. How come? And the answer is as follows. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein wrote what is now a 9-volume set of responsa called Igrot Moshe. Most of the queries posed in that volume precede 1976, precede the time when Dayan Lopian spent time with him. So Dayan Lopian's name doesn't really appear in those volumes. But he spent 5 months with him, literally in his house, and then there was a 10-year overlap. And so in recent years, Rav Moshe Feinstein's grandson, and here you have the front piece of that set, Rav Mordechai Tendler, has published 4 volumes called Masoros Moshe, collecting the rulings that Rav Moshe Feinstein delivered through his telephone conversations and through his interactions with people that are not recorded in Igros Moshe. So Igrot Moshe, the responsa, the penned responses of Rav Moshe Feinstein to people that wrote to him with halachic queries. Masoros Moshe is a collection of the oral rulings of Rav Moshe Feinstein from face-to-face conversations or telephone conversations. Now you'll note, so far 4 volumes have been published. The first was published a year before the Dayan was nifta in 2013. And the last 3 volumes were published after he was nifta, volume 2, 3, and 4, 2016, 18, and 21. Now, in volume 1, I think there's one reference to Dayan Lopian. We're going to see that. But actually, in the next 3 volumes, a number of the queries that Dayan Lopian asked Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, or the rulings that Dayan Lopian recorded that he heard from Moshe Feinstein, are found in these books. And so Rabbi Mordechai Tendler was in contact with the Dayan before he was nifta, and he recorded all these traditions, all these rulings, which he'd heard from his teacher, and he wrote them down in these books. Now, ahead of preparing the shiur, I reached out to Rabbi Mordechai Tendler, his son-in-law, wrote back to me, Rabbi Moshe Kaufman, and I said, are there any rulings that aren't in these 4 volumes? Are you planning a next volume? And he said, yes. And just yesterday, he sent me another 15 rulings, which Dayan Lopian had transmitted to Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, which are set to be published in the next volume or 2. So in total, from this 4-volume set and whatever's yet to be published, there are about 30 or so rulings which Dayan Lopian has recorded, or Dayan Lopian has been able to transmit that he heard from his teacher, which are now being recorded in this book, of which some we're going to study right now. Now, the question then is, what do we do with this material? Firstly, we should study it. But secondly, it's telling what queries Dayan Lopian asked Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. Because some, by the way, are questions that arose in Edrei Yeshua and synagogue. Some are queries that arose in his study, which people came to ask him, and he reached out to his rabbi, he reached out to his teacher. And some were things that just were on the mind of Dayan Lopian, or he just overheard or had a conversation with Rabbi Moshe Feinstein about. But through those conversations and through those dialogues, rulings of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein not only have been transmitted by Dayan Lopian, but they've also been influenced by him by the questions he asked. Just think about that. Their books and their rulings of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, which are recorded around the world, where people don't necessarily realize that the questioner was our Rav, Dayan Gershon Lopian, and his sensitivity and his queries led to those topics being addressed. So what we're going to do now is review about 10 or 12 queries posed by Dayan Lopian to Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, or heard by Dayan Lopian from Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, recorded in these books and a few others that we'll see in a moment. And as a result of that, we'll get a sense of their relationship. We'll get a sense of the kind of, shall we say, halachic personality that Dayan Lopian was. And just before we do that, I do want to say one thing. Many of you may remember the Shabbos when Dayan Lopian formally retired, so-called retired, and Dayan Lichtenstein came to speak. Do you remember that? He came for Shabbos and he gave a nice drasha. And then a few days later, I had a reason to see Dayan Lopian, and I said, okay, I heard what Dayan Lichtenstein said, which is, Reb Gershon, hopefully you'll have now time to write Sfarim. So I said to Dayan Lopian, so how's that going? Maybe I was a little bit of a chutzpah guy, but what can I do? I said, Dayan Lopian, how's your sefer going? To which he said, I have nothing original to write. These are his words. I have nothing original to say. I said, Dayan Lopian, with all due respect, that's not the case. All your rulings are incredibly original. Then they're so important. They've guided us. For his and his humility, he said, I have nothing original to say. And though there are other queries of Dayan Lopian in a few other responsive volumes, he himself never wrote a sefer. There are a few essays that he wrote, which you can find in some rabbinic journals. He himself never wrote a sefer, which is why this shiur is itself, I think, important. Because this is where we see some of the queries which were on the mind of our teacher, which was so significant that he asked them to his teacher. And so in these questions, we hear our Rav, we hear our posek. And in those answers, we hear actually some of the things that he would have told us, or at least we saw with our own eyes in his rabbinic leadership in our community. So we're going to go through these 10 to 12 questions, but actually maybe now is a good time in case, are there any things I've said so far that people want clarifications about? Just before we jump into the 10 to 12 halachic queries, is there anything I've said that either wasn't understood or haven't been clear about that somebody would like to share? I guess not. Okay, so we shall begin. When we begin this, what I've done is I put together 10 to 12 of the about 30 queries as they asked of Dayan Lopian. And here's the first one found in Chelek Aleph. This is the one volume that came out before he was nifta. The question, and I want to read you the words, the question posed here is it appropriate to be a Masada Kiddushin for a couple who aren't going to be observing the laws of family purity? As we know, those are laws which were very, very dear to Dayan Lopian, that he founded, not more just founded, enabled the Edra Mikveh. And here we have Heshiv Rabbeinu al Sheila Sheshalu of Gershon Lopian. That means Rabbi Moshe Feinstein answered the question that Dayan Gershon Lopian asked of him, relating to be Masada Kiddushin for a couple who aren't going to observe Taras Mishpach. Now, before we even read on, what does that tell us? Well, all of us who knew Dayan Lopian, it tells us that the Dayan was makbid about halacha, but also makbid about inclusion, about kiruv v'chaikim, about helping people no matter where they were. So this is a query that arose perhaps soon after he arrived to Edgware. And he discusses this with Rabbi Moshe Feinstein either on the phone once he's arrived at Edgware Yeshurun, or maybe even before he does so, when he's doing shimush with him. The question he's asking his teacher is, what's the story about being Masada Kiddushin for a couple who don't observe the laws of family purity? To which Rabbi Moshe Feinstein answers, it is permitted to be a Masada Kiddushin for a couple who you know are not going to be observing the laws of family purity. Because even though there is a notion that you should be teaching them to observe these laws, and encourage them, and maybe even give them a little bit of a reminder about those obligations. Rabbi Moshe says, and if that person's a Rav, and that's his responsibility, then he should try, and then he has to do the weddings no matter. Now, for most of us, we may well say, well, this is obvious. But just remember, this query was asked at some period between 1975 and 1986, probably the earlier part of it. And what that means is Dayan Lopian was trying to ask himself, how am I going to be a Rav in a community and to be a Rav to people beyond that community? May well be less Torah observant in a community at that point that didn't have a mikveh. And what are my loyalties? What are my duties? And he raises this query with his teacher, and he receives guidance. And in so doing, as we know, this is who he was. As I mentioned, he was my Masada Kiddushin as well as many, many others as well. But this question speaks volumes about the kind of things Dayan Lopian was thinking about, probably even before he joined our shul and afterwards as well. How to find the balance right between supporting all of those members of his community and beyond, and still being absolutely loyal to halacha, and while encouraging people to keep many mitzvahs, especially that relating to Taras Mishpach. That's question number one, which really is self-explanatory. Let's deal with question number two. By the way, they may well seem random. That's because they kind of are. This is just a collection of random queries. The Rav Moshe either ruled that Dayan Lopian passed on, or Dayan Lopian asked him, and as a result of that, these are recorded in this sefer. This now comes from Chelek Gimel. Chelek Gimel was published in 2018, 4 years after Dayan Lopian was nifta, where a lot more of the queries that Dayan Lopian asked Rabbi Moshe Feinstein are found. And we're told, Amali Arava Goan Rab Gershon Lopian. So Rab Mordechai Tendler says, I heard from Dayan Lopian, Sh'amar lo Rabbeinu, that Rabbi Moshe Feinstein told him, Shmutar lasim lahasir atiyah plaster b'Shabbat. You're allowed to put on and take off a plaster on Shabbos. There was a query amongst contemporary poskim about the propriety of using plasters on Shabbos. Some of us may well think, well, obviously you can, but there was a machlokes at the time. What did Dayan Lopian do? He showed Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, he says, have a look what it says in Shmir Shabbos. Quoting Shlomo Zalman, who you may well know also taught Dayan Lopian, who says you should be strict and not do so. Amar Rabbeinu said Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, meaning that's not just surprising, it's very, very bemusing that Rabbi Shlomo Zalman would be machmir and say you shouldn't use plaster on Shabbos because it seems quite obvious that that's mutter. Again, why is it significant that our Rav asked that question? Because something which we take for granted as being mutter, somebody had to ask the question first, and it was Dayan Lopian. And even though the books at that time said you shouldn't, he raised it with Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein said it's fine. And from there became a tradition, which certainly is normative now, that using plaster on Shabbos is absolutely permitted. But know that until you have a question, you don't have a ruling. And Dayan Lopian was not just a ruler, a posek for us, he was also a questioner for us and Klal Yisrael in terms of the rulings of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, which are either recorded here in this set or elsewhere for that matter. Moving on to query number 3. And query number 3 actually relates to if you're in the middle of Psukei de Zimra, and for example, another prayer that you wish to participate in is being led by the Chazan, can you stop midway through? Amali Rav Gon Reb Gershon Lopian Sheishiv La Rabbeinu Shmedalgim Psukei de Zimra. If you are skipping Psukei de Zimra, Ene Daleg Me'emtza Mizmor. You shouldn't do that from the middle of a chapter of the Tehillim. The Hainu Shem Oiches Be'emtza Mizmor or Parsha Mo Az Yashir Tzech Kodim L'Saimo. If you want to join another prayer, first finish this one and then join the prayer. He then says, though, if the prayer you have is just a series of different verses which have been put together by our sages, then every verse stands to itself and you'll be able to pause and join the other tefillah. It's a minor rule, shall we say, in terms of ending one prayer to join another. But here too, it's Dayan Lopian is asking a practical question which has a bearing on how we join communal prayers when our private prayers perhaps are running late. So that's query number 3. Let's look at query number 4, and I think you'll like this language, or it may remind you of having heard this language. Apparently, somebody had said that ultimately breastfeeding on Shabbos is only allowed because either the baby is considered to be partially sick or the mother who's breastfeeding is considered to be partially sick. So we give a license to breastfeed on Shabbos. But were that not to be the case, technically breastfeeding should be also on Shabbos. Somebody said that. Let's hear the first line. Shemati ma'agon ma'arav Gershon Lopian she'amar b'shem Rabbeinu. Dayan Lopian said in the name of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, the Masha Amar Adam Masiyam, that which a specific person said, it must have been a very particular person who offered this opinion. It must have been somebody significant enough for it to be raised in conversation between Dayan Lopian and Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. The Kol Masha Mutala Li'Ishala Aniket Bana B'Shabbat U'Mitzad Dahave Chola She'en B'Sakana. The whole permission granted for a woman to breastfeed on Shabbat is because this is considered to be a situation of somebody who's sick, not dangerously sick, but sick nevertheless, and that's why license is given. But otherwise, this would be prohibited. And here are the words which either Rav Moshe said to the Dayan, or the Dayan interpreted from Moshe, Zeu shtut legamri, or shtus legamri. Or to quote Dayan Lopian, I think most of us have heard the words, narishkeit, nonsense, rubbish. Next. Now, the very fact that this was recorded isn't to the credit of this person who held this particular belief. But again, sometimes what a person needs to do is dispel myths. Somebody had said something. Who knows? It could have caught on. People may have thought that to be the case. Just think about the consequences of that. Dayan Lopian made it very clear, transmitting the ruling of his teacher, that that's shtus legamri, right? Legamri mutter, it's permitted. And then the questioner said, how about, is it permitted for a woman to breastfeed a baby on Shabbos afternoon if they could wait till after Shabbos? Maybe it's like preparation. To which they also said, it's ridiculous, it's fine. And then there was a further claim to which a similar kind of dismissive response is given. Many times when we'd go to Dayan Lopian, he'd always take us as people seriously, but he would always ask when we questioned a certain practice, he would say, begin with a process, which is this a shaila? And many times what we asked wasn't even a shaila. Sometimes it was just, it didn't apply. Sometimes it was just nonsense. This is a case of it not just being nonsense. And his kind of reactions to those kind of queries seems to be echoing the kind of reactions of his teacher, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, to these kind of sentiments and opinions that had been shared in the Lower East Side at some point or another in the time that he knew him. That's query number 4. Again, just look, here's a sefer with the name of our Rebbe, with him transmitting the teachings of his teacher, and with him sometimes asking those queries himself. And I want to get to the next one because it's actually so important, notwithstanding its brevity. A question is asked by the poskim: are you supposed to pay maisa money, charity money, if you're currently in debt? If you're in debt, should you also give maisa money? That doesn't mean should you give tzedakah if somebody comes knocking your door, but should you calculate the 10%, or do you have a duty to pay back your debts before you do so? Here we're told, Amani Rav Gon, Reb Gershon Lopian, Sheishiv Rabbeinu, that Rabbi Moshe Feinstein ruled, Shebavadai tzech adam l'shalem kodem et chovotav lifnei shnoten ma'ot ma'asel. Without a doubt, a person has a duty to pay back their debts before they start paying maisa. Now, a number of other poskim say that, but just think how important that is. Too often a person can be in debt and yet they'll think they have a religious responsibility to also pay maisa, and all of a sudden they're in even worse debt. Being financially responsible is a requirement of halacha, and Rav Moshe, and transmitted it by Dayan Lopian, says, if you're in debt, your job is to pay that off first before you start paying maisa too. That money isn't yours for you to give in the first place. It's for you to pay back whomever you owe, be it the bank or somebody else for that matter. Just think again. Do I know exactly how that question arose? No. Did the question arise from Edrei Yeshurun synagogue, from our membership? Possibly. Was it somebody else in the wider world? Maybe. Was it just a query that was on the mind of Dayan Lopian? Perhaps. But he asked that question, and in so doing, it gave clarity on a really important and delicate point, which, if misunderstood, can cause people to be in significant financial trouble. Let's move on to just a few more queries. I don't know about you, but I remember when either I used to come and get a bracha from the Dayan from that chair that you can see in the background picture, or when I go to his house, and his desk would be piled high with svarim. And I'd sometimes wonder, it seemed to be that Dayan Lopian was less makpid about putting certain books above certain books. You know, we're told that Malim B'Kodesh Ve'em Maridin, and therefore you should only have holier books above less holy books. Actually, this is a query that he asked of his teacher. But Moshe Feinstein had a slightly creative perspective on some of these things. Some is obvious, some less. I'll just read the first bit. V'shamati agod ma'Rav Gershon Lopian, sheshama Rabbeinu. Reb Gershon Lopian passed on the ruling of Reb Moshe Feinstein. D'chol sifrei Torah shebal peh shaveh kedushatam. All oral law books, be it a Mishnah, a Gemara, Shulchan Aruch, are all equivalent in their sanctity. L'gabei haniach sefer al sefer. You don't need to say maybe the Shulchan Aruch has more psukim quoted than the Gemara. The Gemara's got more psukim quoted than the Mishnah, and start doing all that kind of stuff. Reb Moshe Feinstein said, no, it's a Torah shebal peh. They're all equivalent. You can pile them as you wish. Shegam sidur nechshav k'Torah shebal peh. Moreover, I would naturally think that Siddur should be on top of a pile, and for example, a Gemara will be less because a Siddur often contains psukim. According to Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, a Siddur is representative of Torah shebal peh, and all Sfarim, all books of the oral tradition, are equivalent sanctity. and therefore they can be piled in whichever which way they are. Then he goes on to says, a chumash and mafarshim b'teilim the chumash. If you have a chumash with commentaries, then it's still a chumash in that sense of the word. Nechshav k'tosh b'chtav, and that's considered to be tosh b'chtav. Legabei kedima ben nach lechumash. And how about if you had a chumash and a nach, which should go on top of both? Of which, if you're making a pile, Amar Rabbeinu Shetana David Dodei Agon Rab David Nechona. The claim of Rab David Feinstein, the uncle of the author, is correct. Shebanach nidpas yeshotek dusham chumash v'shlanicha agabe chumash. He argues that a nach can go on top of a chumash. That certainly requires a little bit more clarification. V'chol tosh b'chtav munachat agabe tosh b'chtav, and all tosh b'chtav can be put on top of tosh b'chtav. So there's a whole reasoning about which svarim can be put on which printed svarim, and some is obvious, some is by no means obvious. But I remember being struck that when it came to Tosh Peh books, the Dayan didn't seem to be makpid, and the answer is because his Rebbe said you don't need to be. So that's what we have here in this ruling number 6, found in Masat Moshe Chelet Gimel. Just before we go on, if you have any queries, perhaps we'll just take a pause for now. Either feel free to unmute or write in the chat. We have about 6 further queries to go through. What I want to emphasize here through our learning is how our teacher, Dayan Lopian, wasn't just a paisek, but also a transmitter of halacha from his teacher, and how his questions have had significant influence to halachic development way beyond our community, and even way beyond his own psakim, because by asking these queries to his teacher, mentor, Moshe Feinstein, those rulings were heard and have been heeded by Jews around the world. Any thoughts, queries? You're a quiet bunch. Okay, let's actually get to question 7. And question 7 is very memorable because those of us who daven in Edrei Yeshua and synagogue remember that there was a time when Dayan Lopian, even in great pain, would stand when the Aron Kodesh was open. And there was a time when it was just too much and would sit when the Aron Kodesh was open, but would still always stand when the Sefer Torah was taken out of the Aron Kodesh. And there were 1 or 2 other people with in ill health, and he would say to them, if I'm sitting, you sit, and if I'm standing, you should stand. And he became ultimately a role model about what to do, especially if you're in pain and showing kavod Torah. Still, as mentioned, there was a long period of time when he would stand when the Aron Kodesh was open. Why did he do so? So here we have a ruling which actually he transmitted from his teacher on this topic. It says, Ra'iti shena naheg Rabbeinu lachmir lamot k'shpotchim ha'aron. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein was machmir to stand up when the Aron Kodesh was open, even if the Sifrei Torah hadn't been taken out. And Dayan Lopian, when he could, was too. And when he couldn't, obviously he didn't. Shamati Marav Rav Gershon Lopian, and I heard from Dayan Lopian, Rabbeini's Birshat Tamahu, that Rabbi Moshe Feinstein's rationale for this is because by opening the Aron Kodesh, this itself suggests there's been a change of status of the Sifrei Kodesh. It's not considered as if they're just sitting in their place. That is to say, opening the Aron Kodesh itself moves the Sifrei Torah therein, not physically, but metaphysically. And that should cause those in the community to stand up. And then if the Sefer Torah is physically taken out, then that's a chiyuv. So this hopefully explains why Dayan Lopian for a long time would still push himself to stand when the Aron Kodesh was open, even if we would argue it's not necessary to do so, because his Rebbe was machmir on that point. We move on to query number 8. In general, we say Shabbos Lizak. We're not supposed to cry out on Shabbat, and therefore we don't necessarily pray for those who are sick in quite the same way on Shabbos as we would do in a weekday, unless they're seriously sick. We're told here, Gam Amali Rav Gershon Lopian, Sh'Rabbeinu Hashiv Shemutar Lagid Tehillim b'Shabbat. There's a machloket whether you're supposed to say Tehillim on Shabbos. Some people say you should, some people say you shouldn't. For the reason that sometimes we say Tehillim for moments of anguish, and should you be feeling anguished on Shabbos or not? Rabbi Moshe Feinstein said it's Mutar Lagid Tehillim b'Shabbat, Gam Perek Vav, even Perek Vav, which talks about disease and illness. You shouldn't need to be adding additional prayers for spiritual anguish or for spiritual growth above and beyond the original prayers. All you need to do is focus on the tefillas that are in the siddur. This, by the way, fits with the general shita, not just of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, and not just of Dayan Lopian, but also his grandfather. I remember once I was speaking with Dayan Lopian, and I was talking about perhaps adding more tefillas, and he said, some people add an extra line of Kishem Hashem Ekra in Mincha. He said, my grandfather never did that. My grandfather basically taught me with a Zayda, Rabbi Dayan Lopian, our job is to say the words of the Siddur with Kavanah. You don't need to add more to it. For Dayan Lopian, adding more tefillas unnecessarily just puts a greater burden of concentrating on more tefillas that we struggle to concentrate with. So here too, that same derech psika, that on Shabbos we shouldn't add more tefillot. Instead, we should concentrate on the tefillot that we have. But if you want to say Tehillim, then that's fine. Here in query number 9, we have an interesting question, which certainly he addressed many times within the Yeshurun community and beyond. If somebody's in the parsha of Shidduchim, what should they reveal about perhaps illnesses or challenges in their life to a prospective match? We're not going to go through the whole thing. Again, I'm happy to send this to anybody who wishes, the PowerPoint as a slides, so you can look through these sources yourself. But I do want to mention the 3 principles that Rabbi Moshe Feinstein says that Dayan Lopian transmitted. Amali Arav Gershon Lopian Sh'Rabbeinu Hashiv Lo Shirak LeGimel Minei Mumim Sheyesh B'Chatan U'Kala Yesh Chiyuv L'Odia Aleim Kodem Sheniksam L'Chiduch. Only with respect to 3 things do you have a duty to reveal that a person has this thing ahead of a shidduch prospect and people starting to meet. Aleph, if a person has a malady that's going to require significant financial investment to heal after wedding, then that should be revealed when a man and woman start dating. If a person has a malady which may affect their ability to have children, or anything which affects their general functionality in the home. Those 3 things have to be revealed before the beginning stages of Shidduchim. If it doesn't fit within those 3 categories, it doesn't need to be revealed. This is a question, by the way, which a lot of people ask, but this kind of clear ruling is rare to be found. And I imagine that this question was asked by Dayan Lopian because many people used to ask him advice about Shidduchim, and he spoke to his teacher and he said, what needs to be revealed, what not? And this is the ruling that Rabbi Moshe gave him, and I'm sure that's the ruling which he advised others through his leadership of the Edrei Yeshurun and elsewhere. Now, I mentioned that so far 4 volumes of this set Masorat Moshe have been published, and there's about 15 different rulings transmitted by Dayan Lopian, of which I've quoted now 9 of them. I also mentioned that I was in contact with the author whose son-in-law, Rav Moshe Kaufman, wrote back to me, and I said, are there any other questions which Dayan Lopian asked Rav Moshe, which he preserved, which are yet to be published in your volume? He very, very kindly wrote back to me and sent me some of those queries, probably about 15, because I'd already had so much material I didn't want to include too much, but I thought I'd include one. So here is a yet unpublished ruling, meaning it's not in a book. This is an email which I received just yesterday, but it's a fascinating question. Rav Gershon Lopian Sha'al, Dayan Lopian asked Rav Moshe Feinstein, what do you do with an Aron Kodesh when it's used, it's tired, and it needs Geniza? What should we do with basically a used Aron Kodesh? Maybe he was referring to the old Aron Kodesh that used to be in the classrooms when me and Kenny Green and others used to do youth services or whatever. Maybe he's referring to something else. But what do we do with the used Aron Kodesh? Does it need Geniza? Heshiv Rabbeinu, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein answered Dayan Lopian, should be Europa, that in Europe, they used to use this for the burial of the dead. They didn't used to bury in coffins. Instead, they'd make a little flat bed, shall we say, for burial. They'd put the body on that bed, and then they'd bury that person. And for an important person, how did they make that bed that they would put the body on and bury him in? They'd use the wood of old arks, of old Aron Kodeshes. So what does Rabbi Moshe Feinstein say? Dayan Lopian? What's an eitzah? What could you do with an old Aron Kodesh? You can use the wood to bury people. He says nowadays though we have pre-made coffins. Ain't eitzah, right? That's not practical. Rav Gershon Sha'alim mutar lachtoch ha'aron lechatichot v'lekovro v'natar ben lahatir. Dayan Lopian asked Rav Moshe Feinstein, is it permitted to chop up the wood of an Aron Kodesh into bits and then bury those bits of wood just out of covered for the Aron Kodesh? Rav Moshe Feinstein said yes. But Ta'an Shabtai and his other son-in-law of Shabtai Rappaport made a point to say, Shasham, he says, we used to chop up the Aron Kodesh in order to bury the dead in. We didn't chop them up just to bury the Aron Kodesh. So Rav Moshe Feinstein basically says, if you've got an Aron Kodesh and it's been used, then you can take the walls apart and you take off the nails, but you shouldn't smash it up. That's not covered for the Sefer Torah. So, in short, if you were to use the wood of an Aron Kodesh to make a semi-coffin, which was done in Europe, so be it. If that's not going to be done, then you should pull apart the Aron Kodesh in a respectful way, but not smash it apart, and then those parts can be buried. Just think. Firstly, it's a very profound ruling, but secondly, this is our Rav who's asking this question. He's not just thinking about the Aron Kodesh as a place that houses the Torah, which is Eitz Chaimina Machazikim Ba, but instead he's asking, how do we treat an Aron Kodesh with covered even after it's been used? So far, I've quoted from the Sefer Masoras Moshe, both its published volumes and unpublished manuscripts. I want to quote two more rulings of Dayan Lopian from other writings, but quoting his teacher, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. This comes from a sefer called Shalmei Nissan, with recording rulings from Nissan Kaplan, but in there, he makes reference to Dayan Lopian. He says, just for you to know, when you're having a meal and when dessert comes, then you're supposed to say a separate bracha for dessert, because that food, which is dessert, generally doesn't accompany bread. And if it doesn't accompany bread, then it requires a separate bracha. The question asked by Dayan Lopian to Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, what's the story with ice cream? Well, ice cream doesn't necessarily go with bread, arguably, but really, is ice cream considered to be like a liquid? And if so, that's tafel, that's secondary to bread, and you wouldn't need say bracha. And if not, then not. So here we have the following. If you have ice cream as dessert, I heard from my uncle, Rabbi Gershon Lopian, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who learned from Moshe Feinstein, you don't have to say a second bracha for ice cream. It's like a liquid, just as by washing for bread, You don't need to say a separate bracha for drinks in a meal. So too, this is the rule for ice cream. Rav Nissen Kaplan then queries that ruling for technical reasons. But it's kind of an interesting thing. Dayan Lopian basically was interested in us having ice cream without having to say an extra bracha. We now come to our final query. And our final query, in many ways, has an introduction. And if I'm not mistaken, my dear friend and old schoolmate, Johnny Greenberg, is here joining us. I was here before, I know this, yeah, there he is. And I want to tell a story from his son's bris. And his son had his bris in Finchley Central Synagogue, and I went along, and a few other Rabbanim were there, and Dayan Lopian came. When Dayan Lopian came, and I think I got there just before him, what did he do? Something which certainly all men on this Zoom are probably familiar with. What did he do? Give me a big kiss, right? So Finchley Central Synagogue, the davening started, Dayan Lopian comes in, he sees me and a whole bunch of other people, gives me a big kiss. Now, another well-known Rav from the UK was there, who knew Dayan Lopian much less well. And at the time, after the bris, we were just talking. He says, tell me something. There's din Shulchan Aruch, you're not supposed to kiss the kids in shul. And in general, it's understood you're not supposed to affectionately kiss people in shul in general. He says, how come Dayan Lopian does that? So we had this brief conversation while this bris milah is happening. And I spoke to him then. And then a few weeks later, I wrote to this Rav and said the following. I wrote this email. This email is from 2013. Actually, not a few weeks. It was a few years later. He says, Shabbat Tov, I hope you and your family are well. I was learning the Sefer. This is me writing, and I came across an insight that reminded me of a conversation that took place between us in Finchley Central Synagogue some years ago. You may recall that Dayan Lopian was present. I kissed him while in shul. In response to this, you queried the base of such behavior. He wasn't saying this. He wasn't criticizing Chas v'Shalom. He says, of course, whatever the Dayan does is right. I just want to understand. You queried the base of such behavior in light of the Ramah's ruling, and my response was such an act was an expression of Kavod HaTorah, meaning I was giving honor to Kavod HaTorah. But my friend, this Rav, was saying, yeah, but that works for you kissing him, but how about him kissing you? So I then said to this friend, since then I became aware of a ruling of the Ben Ish Chai, which is cited in the Piskei Teshuvos, which also suggests that such an act constitutes Kavod HaTorah, constitutes giving honor to a Torah personality. And then I said that I recently learned to Sefer, and this is a quote below, that basically captures that idea that to kiss somebody who is an Ishiyut Shel Torah, it says at the bottom, is not in conflict with the ruling of the Ramah. Okay, that's what I said. Interesting. If you can see in the brackets, it said we subsequently spoke about this, and you mentioned that such an act may be considered permitted, given it took place prior to Tefillah itself. I thought that was an interesting svara, but I didn't say anything about it. A couple of years ago, when looking through different rabbinic journals, I saw the end of an essay by Dayan Westheim discussing kissing in shul. He writes the following: Ka'et Chaya Shamati Miyedidi Rav Agon Morena Rav Gershon Lopian. He says, just recently I was talking with Dayan Lopian, and what does Dayan Lopian say about kissing in shul? Sheshama me'agon Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, that he heard from his teacher. Shesava kein halacha lemase. He says that kissing is permitted. Why? At least in this particular case, for the reasons I've explained previously in my essay. Because the Ramah in Siman Tzadichet, he doesn't bring this din in Hilchos Beis HaKnesses, in the laws relating to synagogue, ela b'Hilchos Tefillah. Meaning this isn't an offense to the synagogue to kiss in shul. It's something which we shouldn't be doing in the middle of davening. So the Dayan, before he would daven, would kiss everybody. At the end of davening, he'd kiss everybody. In the middle of davening, he wouldn't. So when he arrived at Finchley Central, before he started davening, he'd say hello and give everybody a tap on the back or give him a kiss. But according to him, quoting his teacher, to kiss in shul before davening or after davening is fine. In the middle of davening, that's a problem. And what's a proof? What he learned from Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, that the prohibition that Ramah discusses is listed not in the rules of the honor given to the synagogue, instead in the rules relating to not interrupting tefillah. We have got one or two more slides to do, but that ends the survey of halachic queries that I wanted to review with you. And I know I've gone through this material quite quickly. I'm cautious and considerate of time. But what I wanted to highlight here is really the remarkable contribution of Dayan Lopian, not just to us and the rulings they gave us that we all know, and I don't need to be somebody who simply repeats that, but also him as a transmitter of halachic decisions of his teacher, of Moshe Feinstein, which only in the past few years has that become more evident to us with the publication of this 4-volume set, Mesoras Moshe, and all the other sources that I quoted. And the very fact that he asked these questions relating to outreach, questions relating to being considerate, questions relating to being financially responsible, the very fact that he addresses issues relating to showing affection in shul. When, those of us who knew Dayan Lopian, we know that was him, that was him, that was him. Yes. These questions which were on his mind are reflective of him and his considered and sensitive approach to halachic decision-making, leading communities and supporting people. Are there any queries? We've got one or two more slides to do. Any queries just before we get to that? I know I'm speaking with many people who have many great memories, but just before we transition towards the end part of this shiur, if you have any questions about things I've shared or anything else you want to share with the crowd here, feel free to do so now.
I've got one question. For those families that attended Family Week in Bexhill and Ackworth, I wonder if there were any particular questions that came up there that people wanted to share. I had questions I asked him, but they're more of a general nature. So it's just a young question, because there were many. I only went to 3, I think, but there were many people that went to the whole series of these shiurim and these weekends and summer camps.
Well, quite possibly. Of course, some of those questions arose after 1986. They wouldn't be recorded in the Yisrael because Rabbi Moshe was since Nifta. But I've shared basically 10 to 12 queries. There's about 20 which I haven't, which I'm happy to share with anybody else who's interested for various reasons. They're too complex or whatever, time reasons as well. But perhaps some of those emerged from those settings. Just for you to know, in some of the unpublished rulings that Rabbi Moshe Klausner sent me, he does make specific reference to certain situations with an Anglo jury, which the Dayan was, I wouldn't say wrestling with, but exploring and addressing, and perhaps some's related to Family Week or some related to the local community, the wider community. It's evident, meaning I hear those queries and I say, I know kind of what you're talking about, which is itself fascinating. Anybody else? I know there's some, again. Yes.
Sorry, quick question. That last pasuk that you mentioned about the halacha of kissing not being involved, not in Shulchan Aruch, not being in Hilchos Tefillah, but in Hilchos Beis HaKnesses. I also heard that from the Dayan, but I don't remember him quoting Rav Moshe. Can I just qualify that is from Rav Moshe?
Put this way, this is from an article by Dayan Westheim, who wrote a whole piece on this, and right at the end he says Dayan Lopian said that he heard from Moshe Feinstein. I mean, it's interesting because in preparing this shiur, and again I went through all these other 20 rulings, it's quite clear that some of the things he would say to our community, obviously with him, there's no question about this. I'm not by no means. The Dayan was a remarkable place. But sometimes there were rulings he heard from his teacher. He didn't always say, Rabbi Moshe told me to say, this is halach. We'd ask the shaila and now be it. And so those of us who knew him would know that sometimes he didn't mess about. You ask a question, you get an answer. He doesn't need to give us all the references and footnotes. In fact, if he was here, he'd say, Johnny, why waste everyone's time? Just tell them what to do. So there would be many occasions, clearly, where the rulings we were receiving were things which he discussed with Moshe or others, and this is one of them. Okay, what I'm going to just do is share my screen and just say just 2 more things, and then we'll wrap up. Those of you who've been to Edmonton, this is the kever of Dayan Lopian. I went there a year after he was Nifta, when I was visiting the UK. And if you've yet to see the inscription on his kever, not only is it here, but here is it translated by me, loosely translated. But I want you to look at this, because not only is it spelling out his name in Hebrew, but saying so much that we knew in English. Great decisive of Jewish law relied on him to respond to them with the word of God, namely halacha. He brought those who are far away closer to God, blessed be He, through showing them the sweetness of the Torah. He loved peace and placed no limits on the pursuit of peace. And many benefited from his counsel and wisdom. The remarkable love of all Jews. And it's such a beautiful, beautiful tribute, which obviously the family wrote. And there we can see there, Yom Hamar Chavtet Lechodesh Shvat Tafshin Ayin Daled, which is 10 years ago today. And I want to just briefly dwell on that last line, that how the Dayan loved all Jews, and how for the past 4 months in particular, the Dayan would have been so aggrieved and would have encouraged us to daven and take on mitzvahs. And none of us are him, but I think we all learnt enough from him to know that would have been his will. And my feeling is, given it's Yahrzeit, it's 10th Yahrzeit, and Am Yisrael need more zchuyot. If we can take on an extra mitzvah, a little bit more lemon Torah than that, both in his merit, but also for the merit of Am Yisrael, then that would be a very, very appropriate thing to do, a very sweet thing to do, and a very beneficial thing to do. I'd like to end by giving the Dayan the last word, because basically, why not? A video was that we probably have seen that tribute video about Dayan Lopian that was shown a couple of weeks before he was nifta for that honorary meal that was held in the Edgeware. If you haven't, it's on YouTube. You just simply type in Dayan Lopian. But it's all about Dayan Lopian. You don't really hear from him. And then there's a last speech that he gave at that meal, which is very touching. It's a story of a blaze garden that you'd say many, many times over. But this is a video that you may not have seen. This is a video made titled Gates of Yeshiva Past and Present, recorded not too long before the Dayan was nifta, and asking people connected to Gates of Yeshiva about their feelings towards Yeshiva. Of course, the Dayan's father was Rosh Yeshiva, and he grew up there, and so the community was very, very dear to him. And this is just one clip. It's about 5 seconds long. You'll blink and you'll miss it. But I feel it encapsulates who is a Dayan, both in how he speaks and what he says. So I thought I'd give him the final words of this shiur. I believe that you should be able to all hear this. So let's go.
Without Torah, what are we? We are nobody. That is the whole tachlis of Am Yisrael, is to propagate Torah.
Ultimately, according to Dayan Lopian, without Torah, what are we? That's the whole mission, to propagate Torah. And all of us who are here learning together, we're doing so in his memory, with great reverence towards our teacher, with great hakaras hatov towards our teacher. But hopefully what I've demonstrated in this shiur is how he himself did the very same to his teacher, not just his singular teacher, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, but his many teachers. And he'd quote them, he'd smile when he did, he'd tell stories about them, but through his psakim, he was channeling that wisdom through the shimush he gave us. He was replicating the shimush he received from them, and that really makes part of us a chain in the Masorah, and something which we should be proud of, and he would be proud of too. To answer a query which is put in the chat, that the Sfarim that I've quoted, unfortunately, are in Hebrew only, but I'm happy to translate specific rulings if people are interested. For those who would like, I can send you this presentation. I'll put in my email address in the chat right now. So if you'd like to be in contact with that, if that would interest you, I'll be more than happy to send that your way. And beyond that, really, that's it. We think about Dayan Lopian the whole time. We love him, we miss him, and we appreciate all that he gave to us. For those of you with a l'chaim who didn't yet have a l'chaim, have one. For those of you who already had a l'chaim, have another one. You didn't need an excuse. And for all of you who've joined, thank you so much for doing so, and for honoring our teacher. And it's important for us to remember him. He wasn't one for social media. He wasn't one for self-publicization. He was very humble, as I say, he didn't write a sefer. But ultimately, his life was a sefer. And in so doing, by being his Talmidim, so too are we. So it's important to bear that in mind. And I thank you. Thank you for joining. And maybe
Can I just ask one thing? John, it's one thing. I remember going to the Lavoya, and I think it was in Edmonton. Or was it Enfield?
Yes.
No, it was Edmonton.
Can't hear you.
He was particular about where he was, where the kavur was.
Yeah.
I just can't remember where it was.
Oh, so I'll tell you the answer, because I just mentioned before. The last speech that Dayan Lopian gave, which you can watch on YouTube, he tells the story of Eliezer Gordon. That story, which he told many, 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 many times for lots of different reasons. It really represented what he believed in. It was one which I heard personally many times. He gave in many shiurim. When he was nifta, and I heard he was going to be buried in England, I said he's going to be buried in Edmonton next to Eliezer Gordon. Literally, it was obvious to me, and that's exactly the case. So his kavur is right next to the burial spot of Eliezer Gordon there, because him being Oshiv of Tells, and what that institution represents in terms of that fusion of commitment to Torah living, but also a deep humanity, was something which very much moved the Dayan. And as I say, the very last speech that we have recorded of him tells the story of Eliezer Gordon, and that's why I wouldn't say that's why, because I wasn't there to decide, but to my mind, that makes sense why he's buried where he is, literally at 2 meters away from the Isle of Reb Gordon. Just for you to know, if you're interested, there's actually a book published by the Federation of Synagogues about important people buried in that cemetery. And there's obviously an entry about Reb Eliezer Gordon, and obviously there's an entry about Dayan Lopian. You can buy that as a physical book. You can even buy it as an ebook. So if you go on the Federation website, there's a book about the history of the Edmonton Cemetery.
Can I, if no one else is going to ask anything, thank you, Rabbi Solomon, for the most beautiful shiur. And I'm sure it's brought back memories to all of us of our shaykhus with the Dayan, Zecher Tzaddik Livrocha. If I can just add a personal memory in relation to the Shaila 9 that you gave about what to reveal during Shidduchim.
Oh, yeah.
He was once telling me that he'd come, a distraught father had come to him. His daughter had become engaged, and there was a vort. And after the vort, the chosen had confided to the potential kala that he had homosexual tendencies. And the father had come to the Dayan to know what to do. Should they continue with the shidduch or call it off, which had tremendous consequences. And the Dayan said, "Where is Reb Moshe when I need him?" And the answer that he gave was that if the chosen has just admitted to tendencies, then there's an awful lot more, probably there's an awful lot more than just tendencies, and they should call off the shidduch. And when members of different communities would come to me and ask me particular about their rabbi, I would say, you do not know what broad shoulders Rabbonim, communal Rabbonim have when they are asked shilas. And I would give that story about the shoulders of Dayan Lopian and how he missed his Rebbe to be able to ask that shilah.
I appreciate you sharing, and that's it. He didn't forget his teachers, and we haven't forgotten ours. And that seems like an apt time to end. So I thank you again, and
thank you, John.
Let me continue to inspire us. My pleasure. My pleasure. You should all be well, and
thanks very much.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you for this.
Thanks.
And l'chaim to those who are going to have a l'chaim.
Right.